The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel did not just provide light. They seemed to judge everything beneath them, casting a prismatic glare that separated the gold from the dross. For Alara, a 26-year-old waitress trying to make herself as invisible as the beige wallpaper, the light felt like an interrogation lamp. She adjusted the collar of her starch-white shirt, the fabric scratching against her neck, and tightened the knot of her crimson apron. This was the charity gala of the season, a convergence of the city's political elite, old money dynasties, and dangerous new players who preferred to remain in the shadows. Alara gripped her tray of champagne flutes with white-knuckled intensity, her eyes fixed on the floor as she navigated the sea of silk gowns and Italian wool suits. She had learned early in her shift that eye contact was interpreted as an invitation for scorn. The air smelled of expensive lilies, roasted duck, and the metallic tang of unspoken ambition. Somewhere in the upper mezzanine, overlooking the shark tank of the ballroom, rumors were circulating about a ghost. They whispered the name Kong Day with a mixture of reverence and nausea. He was a mythic figure in the underworld, a man who had consolidated the fractured syndicates of the Eastern District into a singular, silent empire. The stories said he had no heart, only a ledger of debts and a graveyard of those who failed to pay them. But Alara knew nothing of crime lords or territory wars. She only knew that her feet ached, her rent was overdue, and the crowd was becoming increasingly raucous as the open bar took its toll. In the center of the room, far from the VIP balconies, a small, elderly Korean woman wandered with a look of profound confusion etched onto her gentle face. She wore a modest dark blue dress, simple and unassuming, which stood out starkly against the aggressively modern cuts of the designer evening wear surrounding her. She looked like a pressed flower trapped in a machine shop. The old woman, whose name was Mrs. Park, though no one here cared to ask, was clutching a small, worn handbag with both hands. She seemed to be searching for someone, her dark eyes darting frantically across the faces of strangers who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Alara watched her from the periphery, feeling a pang of sympathy that she quickly tried to suppress. Empathy slowed you down in this line of work. Mrs. Park took a tentative step backward, trying to avoid a rushing server, and in her disorientation, she turned sharply. It was a simple accident, a matter of physics and bad timing. Her shoulder brushed against the arm of a woman holding a glass of vintage Pinot Noir. The liquid sloshed, a few dark droplets landing on the woman's expensive luxury cream-colored coat. The music seemed to stop, though the orchestra played on. The atmosphere in the immediate vicinity curdled instantly, shifting from festive indifference to predatory anticipation. Alara froze, her tray trembling slightly, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure that always preceded a storm. The woman in the cream-colored coat was Veronica Vance, the wife of a real estate tycoon and a person whose cruelty was often mistaken for personality. She did not just react. She erupted. Veronica spun around, her face twisting into a mask of incredulous rage. She looked down at the microscopic stain on her pristine coat, then up at the fragile woman who had caused it. Mrs. Park shrank inward, bowing her head rapidly, her hands trembling as she began to apologize in broken, whispered Korean, interspersed with the only English word she seemed to trust.
Sorry. So sorry.
Please, her voice was a dry leaf scraping against pavement, barely audible over the din of the party. But Veronica was not interested in apologies. She was interested in theater. She needed a victim to validate her status, and fate had delivered one that looked unable to fight back. Do you have any idea what you just did? Veronica's voice was a whip crack, cutting through the ambient chatter. Heads turned. The circle of bystanders expanded, creating an arena of silence around the two women. This is custom Valentino, Veronica hissed, stepping closer, looming over Mrs. Park like a hawk cornering a field mouse. It costs more than your entire life's earnings. And you just ruined it with your clumsiness. Who let you in here? You don't belong here. Look at you. The insults were not just about the coat. They were about existence. Veronica's eyes scanned Mrs. Park's simple dress with open disgust. The crowd watched with a passive, morbid curiosity of drivers passing a car crash. No one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy and powerful, who prided themselves on their philanthropy during the speeches, were now paralyzed by their own social cowardice. Mrs. Park continued to bow, tears beginning to well in her eyes, her small frame shaking with humiliation. She looked small, terribly alone and terrified. Alara felt a heat rising in her chest, a burning sensation that started in her stomach and moved up to her throat. It was the friction of injustice scraping against her conscience. She looked at the security guards standing by the walls. They were looking at their phones or deliberately looking away. Alara set her tray down on a nearby table with a clatter that went unnoticed. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was nobody. She was a waitress with $20 in her bank account and a uniform that didn't fit quite right. Interfering could cost her this job, and she needed this job. But as she watched Veronica raise a manicured finger to poke the old woman's shoulder, something inside Alara snapped. Or perhaps it solidified. She pushed off the wall, her legs moving before her brain could authorize the action. She cut through the circle of onlookers, her red apron flashing like a warning sign. She didn't have a plan. She just had the overwhelming instinct that she could not watch a mother be broken for sport. She stepped into the center of the ring, placing her body between the sobbing Mrs. Park and the towering rage of Veronica. The sudden appearance of the waitress confused Veronica for a microsecond, her finger hovering in the air. "That's enough," Alara said. Her voice shook, betraying her terror, but the words were clear. She stood with her back to Mrs. Park, acting as a human shield. She apologized. "It was an accident. Please, leave her alone." The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy and suffocating. A waitress commanding a socialite was a violation of the natural order more shocking than the wine stain. Veronica's expression shifted from anger to amusement, a cold, reptilian smile spreading across her face. She looked Alara up and down, noting the cheap fabric of her white shirt, the fraying strings of the red apron, the scuffed work shoes. "Excuse me?" Veronica laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "The help is speaking? I didn't order a moral lecture, honey. I ordered you to get out of my face." "She is an elderly woman," Alara persisted, her hands clenched into fists at her sides to hide the tremors. She could feel Mrs. Park's hand gripping the back of her apron, a desperate anchor in the storm. That light touch gave Alara a surge of frantic courage. "You're humiliating her over a dry cleaning bill." "Just stop." Veronica's eyes narrowed. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, hard malice. She didn't like being challenged, certainly not by someone she viewed as furniture. Veronica raised her glass, which was still half full of the dark red wine. "You want to be a hero?" she whispered, her voice low and dangerous. "Then you can share the consequences." Without a flicker of hesitation, Veronica flicked her wrist forward. The wine flew from the glass in a dark arc, a liquid slap designed to degrade. The cold liquid hit Alara square in the chest. It soaked instantly into the white cotton of her shirt, spreading outward like a gunshot wound, dripping down her front and splashing onto the pristine floor. The shock of the temperature and the wetness made Alara gasp, but she didn't step aside. She blinked, wine dripping from her chin, standing her ground. The red stain on her white shirt was visually violent, a stark marker of the cruelty that had just transpired. The ballroom went deathly quiet. This was no longer a social faux pas. It was an assault. Veronica smirked, satisfied with her handiwork, and turned to her friends, expecting validation. "Oops," she said flatly. "Now you match the decor," but no one laughed. The air in the room had changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was breathless. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. From the shadows of the mezzanine staircase, a sound echoed, the slow, rhythmic clap of leather shoes descending marble steps. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The crowd parted instinctively, a wave of bodies receding from the staircase, as if repelled by a magnetic force. Down the stairs walked a man who seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He was dressed in a suit cut so sharply it looked like a weapon, charcoal gray, with a black shirt and no tie. His hair was swept back, revealing a face that was handsome but carved from something harder than granite. A jagged, pale scar ran along his jawline, a permanent reminder of violence survived. This was Kong Dae. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the security. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were locked onto the scene in the center of the room. The weeping mother, the soaked waitress, and the woman with the empty glass. He moved with a predatory grace, a silent lethality that made the hair on the back of Alara's neck stand up. He wasn't rushing. Predators don't rush when the prey is already trapped. As Kong Dae reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispers died completely. The fear he projected was not theatrical. It was the quiet, absolute authority of a man who could end a life as easily as he breathed. He walked straight to the center of the circle, his presence displacing the air around him. Veronica, sensing the shift, turned to face him. Her arrogance wavered slightly, but she didn't know him. She saw only a wealthy Asian man, perhaps a potential investor. Finally, she scoffed, trying to regain control of the narrative. Someone with some sense. Can you believe the incompetence of the staff here? This girl just... Kong Dae walked past her as if she did not exist. He didn't even blink. The dismissal was absolute. He stopped in front of Mrs. Park, his stony expression cracking for a fraction of a second into something agonizingly tender. "Alma," he said softly, a word that sounded like a prayer in the silence. He reached out, his large, scarred hands cupping his mother's face, wiping away a tear with a thumb that had pulled triggers. Mrs. Park looked up, her weeping slowing as she recognized her son. She leaned into his touch, murmuring his name, pointing a trembling finger at Alara, then at Veronica, trying to explain. Kong Dae nodded slowly, hushing her. "I know," he whispered. "I saw." He then turned his gaze to Alara. Up close, his energy was overwhelming, a mix of high-voltage danger and strange, intense focus. He looked at the wine soaking her shirt, the way it clung to her skin, the humiliation she was wearing like a badge of honor because she had chosen to protect his blood. He looked at her eyes, which were wide with fear but still held a spark of defiance. For a long moment, the Mafia boss and the waitress just looked at each other, the chaotic world around them fading into a blur. Kong Dae removed his suit jacket. The movement was fluid and controlled. The silk lining shimmered under the chandeliers. With a gentleness that contradicted every rumor about him, he draped the jacket over Alara's shoulders, covering the wine stain, enveloping her in his warmth and the scent of sandalwood and gun oil. It was a claiming, a protective seal. He adjusted the collar so it wouldn't slip, his knuckles grazing her neck, causing her to shiver. "You are cold," he stated, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a question. He then pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "For your face," he murmured. Only then, after ensuring the safety and dignity of the two women, did he slowly turn on his heel to face Veronica. The transformation in his body language was terrifying. The tenderness evaporated, replaced by a cold, mechanical malice. He adjusted his cufflinks, staring at Veronica with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a bacteria. Veronica's confidence crumbled. She realized, too late, that she was not the predator in this room. She was the meal. "You," she stammered, the glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. "Do you know who my husband is?" "I do not care who your husband is," Kong Dae said, his voice calm, carrying to the back of the room without him raising it. "But by tomorrow morning, he will wish he had never met you." He took a single step forward, invading her personal space, forcing her to step back onto the broken glass of her own making. You spilled wine on two things tonight, he continued, his eyes dead and flat. My mother, and the only person in this room with a soul. He gestured slightly to Alara. That jacket is worth more than your life. If another drop of wine touches her, or my mother, he let the sentence hang, an open loop of violence that was far more terrifying than a specific threat. Apologize, he commanded. On your knees. Veronica looked around for help, but the crowd had abandoned her. Her husband was nowhere to be seen. She looked at Kangdae's face and saw her own destruction written there. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Alara watched, clutching the lapels of the massive jacket, feeling the weight of the man's power draped over her, realizing with a sudden, dizzying clarity that her life of invisibility was over. She was now the center of the ghost's world. The sound of knees hitting the marble floor was sickeningly audible, a dull thud that echoed through the cavernous ballroom. Veronica Vance, a woman who had spent her life looking down on the world from the heights of penthouse balconies, was now physically lower than the people she employed. She gasped as her knees found the shards of her own broken wine glass, the sharp edges biting into her skin through the stockings, but she dared not move. Kangdae stood over her, his shadow stretching long and dark across her trembling form. He did not gloat. He did not smile. His face remained a mask of impassive granite, his eyes stripping away her social standing until she was nothing more than a frightened creature realizing the food chain had shifted. I am waiting, Kangdae said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. The orchestra had stopped playing. The waiters had stopped serving. The entire gala held its breath, witnessing the dismantling of an untouchable elite by a force of nature they did not understand. I'm sorry, Veronica whispered, her voice cracking, tears of rage and terror cutting tracks through her foundation. She looked up at Mrs. Park, who was clinging to Alara's arm, her face buried in the waitress's shoulder. I'm sorry, Veronica repeated, louder this time, desperation creeping in as she saw Kangdae's expression darken at her hesitation. I was wrong. Please. I apologize. It was a humiliation so complete that some of the onlookers looked away, unable to stomach the raw display of dominance. But Alara did not look away. She watched, her heart thundering against the silk lining of Kangdae's jacket, realizing that this man was exacting a retribution that the law never would. He was balancing the scales of the universe in real time. Kangdae stared at the kneeling woman for a beat longer than necessary, letting the terror settle into her bones, ensuring the lesson would outlast the bruising. Then, with a dismissive flick of his hand, he released her from his attention. She was no longer a threat. She was debris. He turned back to Alara and his mother, the violence in his eyes instantly evaporating into a pool of deep, solicitous concern. We are leaving, he stated, not as a command to them, but as a fact of reality. He placed one hand on the small of his mother's back and the other, hesitating for just a moment, hovered near Alara's elbow before gently guiding her. The crowd parted like the Red Sea before Moses. No one dared to photograph them. No one dared to whisper. As they walked toward the grand exit, Alara felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt enveloped in a force field of absolute protection. They walked through the gilded doors, leaving the suffocating perfume of the gala behind for the crisp, cold air of the night, where a fleet of black SUVs waited with engines idling, their exhaust plumes rising like smoke signals into the dark city sky. The interior of the lead vehicle, a stretch Maybach, was quieter than a cathedral and smelled of rich leather and ozone. The doors closed with a heavy, reassuring thud, sealing out the noise of the city and the trauma of the evening. Alara sat on the plush bench seat, her body finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline crashed. Mrs. Park sat beside her, still holding Alara's hand in a vice grip, refusing to let go of the girl who had saved her. Kangdae sat opposite them, pouring a glass of water from a crystal decanter. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic. He handed the glass to Alara, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with fear. Drink, he said softly. The shock comes later. You need to be hydrated. Alara took the glass, her teeth chattering against the rim. The water was cold and clean, washing away the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. Thank you, she whispered, the words feeling inadequate against the magnitude of what had just happened. She looked down at the jacket still draped over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled intoxicatingly of him. I should give this back. She moved to slide the jacket off, but Mrs. Park made a sharp, protesting noise, shaking her head rapidly. The old woman spoke in rapid-fire Korean to her son, gesturing emphatically at Alara's stained shirt and then at her own heart. Kangdae listened, his hard features softening as he looked from his mother to the waitress. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth, a crack in the armor. My mother says you are not to remove it, Kangdae translated, his eyes locking onto Alara's. She says it is the mantle of a queen, and you have earned it. She also asks why a girl with trembling hands has the heart of a lion. Alara blushed, the heat rising to her cheeks. I didn't think, she admitted, looking down at her scuffed work shoes sinking into the thick carpet of the car. I saw her face. My grandmother used to look like that when people were unkind. I couldn't watch it happen again. The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. Kangdae leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the physical distance between them. The intimacy of the space was overwhelming. Most people look away, he said, his voice low and raspy. In my world, everyone looks away. They see suffering and they calculate the cost of intervention. You saw suffering and you paid the cost without asking the price. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face again, as if he wanted to touch her but was restraining himself. You have no idea what you have done tonight, Alara. You did not just save an old woman from embarrassment. You saved me from burning that building to the ground. The car ride continued in a comfortable, heavy silence, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows like streaks of neon paint. But the peace was a facade. As the convoy moved into the industrial district, heading toward the private estate where Kangdae's empire was headquartered, the atmosphere shifted. Kangdae's phone buzzed, a single, short vibration. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth vanished from his eyes instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a general under siege. He tapped the partition window, signaling the driver. Change route, he commanded, his voice clipping the air. Blue protocol. We have a tail. Alara felt the car accelerate, the engine growling deep in its throat. Mrs. Park whimpered, sensing the change, and Alara instinctively put her arm around the old woman, reversing their roles of protector and protected. What is happening? Alara asked, her voice rising in panic as the car swerved sharply around a corner. Kangdae did not answer immediately. He was reaching under his seat, pulling out a sleek, matte black firearm. He checked the chamber with a mechanical efficiency that was terrifying to watch. Veronica's husband is a foolish man, Kangdae said calmly, as if discussing the weather. He has sent men to intercept us. He believes humiliation can be washed away with violence. He looked at Alara, his eyes fierce and blazing.
Get down.
On the floor. Cover my mother. The command was absolute. Alara didn't hesitate. She slid off the leather seat, pulling Mrs. Park down with her into the footwell, curling her body over the old woman just as the rear window shattered. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched crack followed by the cascade of safety glass. The car swerved violently. Bullets pinged against the reinforced chassis, sounding like hail on a tin roof. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, screaming internally, but she didn't let go of Mrs. Park. Above them, Kangdae was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He didn't shout, he didn't panic. He moved with the economy of a master assassin, returning fire through the broken window, his shots measured and precise. The smell of gunpowder filled the luxury cabin, mixing with the scent of spilled water and fear. Stay down, Kangdae roared. The first time he had raised his voice, a sound of pure, protective fury. The car spun 180 degrees, the tires screeching in protest, as the driver executed a tactical maneuver. Alara felt the G-force pinning her against the carpet, her world reduced to the smell of dust and the sound of gunfire. Suddenly, it was over. The car lurched to a halt. Silence rushed back in, ringing in Alara's ears. She was trembling so hard her teeth rattled. She felt a hand on her shoulder, heavy, firm, grounding. She looked up to see Kangdae leaning over the seat, his gun lowered but still in hand. There was a cut on his cheek, a thin line of red against the pale skin, but his eyes were frantically scanning her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice breathless.
Alara.
"Look at me. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak, checking Mrs. Park, who was weeping silently but unharmed. Kangdae let out a breath that sounded like a shudder. He reached down and hauled Alara up with one arm, pulling her into his chest. He buried his face in her hair, holding her so tight it almost hurt. For a moment, the Mafia boss was gone, and there was just a man who had almost lost the only light he had found in years. "I have them," he whispered into her hair, a vow of vengeance and protection. "I have you. They will never touch you again." The safe house was less of a house and more of a fortress disguised as a brutalist architectural masterpiece carved into the side of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The walls were raw concrete, the windows bulletproof glass, the art on the walls priceless and disturbing. Kangdae had carried his mother to her quarters and then returned to the main atrium where Alara stood, still wearing his ruined jacket, staring out at the crashing waves below. She looked like a ghost in the vast, sterile space. The events of the night were catching up to her, the adrenaline fading into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She heard his footsteps approach, softer now, stripped of the urgency of the gunfight. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the invisible barrier between her civilian world and his violent reality. He had washed the blood off his hands, but the aura of danger still clung to him. "You should go," Kangdae said, his voice hollow. He didn't look at her. He looked at the reflection of the room in the dark glass. "I can have a car take you anywhere. Another city. Another country. I will set you up with enough money that you never have to wear an apron again." He turned to face her, his expression pained. "You saw what my life is tonight. It is not galas and champagne. It is broken glass and bullets. You are too bright for this darkness, Alara. Go before I destroy you." It was a noble offer, a rejection born of love. He was giving her the exit ramp. He expected her to run. Anyone sane would run. Alara turned from the window. She looked at the man who had terrified a room full of elites, who had shot back at assassins without blinking, but who was now looking at her with the terrified vulnerability of a boy. She saw the loneliness that lived in the marrow of his bones. She thought of the way he had held his mother. She thought of the jacket around her shoulders. She stepped forward, crossing the distance he had put between them. "No," she said simply. Kangdae blinked, confused. "No," he repeated. "Did you not hear me? I am a monster, Alara. I have blood on my hands that will never wash off. I saw a son who loves his mother," Alara countered, her voice gaining strength. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had held the gun. It was cold and rough. She sandwiched it between hers, warming it. "And I saw a man who put his body between me and a bullet. I've been invisible